Welcome everyone. I'm Susan Hammond with Big Little Science Center. I thank you all for coming today. It's a real treat to have you here. We've got some new faces we haven't seen before. And before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that Big Little Science Center is open year-round, Tuesday through Saturday, with all sorts of activities, as you've seen, for children and for adults right through. We also run summer camps, professional development for children as well as adults. And we do, on the side tonight, have some treats, so do help yourselves to that. We've got just some cookies and some grapes, but also beside that, you'll notice that we've got two different fundraisers going on right now for a limited time, for June only. So you've got not quite a week. We have Duffy's dinner tickets for sale. They're $25 each for a full meal. They're amazing. You have a choice of 3 different meals. We went earlier, a few weeks ago, and it was such good meal, food, everything, good service. Duffy's does it really good. So if you're looking for a night out, we encourage you to get a ticket here and then organize it with them. Give them a call and book it so that they know it's part of the fundraiser. The other fundraiser is a raffle 50-50 draw. If you get your ticket through the QR code, or you can go online and search Big Little Science Center raffle, that is all done online. I don't have any tickets for that tonight. The draw is coming up later in July, and the lucky winner gets 50%, half of the pot. So if you can help us out that way, that's amazing. Or it doesn't matter even if you don't help us in either way. Spread the word about the Science Center, share about us, and share about our draws and things. We'll restart the lectures next fall. This is our last one for the year with Megan Blackmore. We're really, really excited to have a master gardener here today. Now, normally Megan actually works with the Invasive Species Council of BC. And in that capacity, she does a whole different angle of things. But tonight, I think we get to hear a little more about your secret passion.
Yes, for sure.
Megan has kindly actually helped many different groups in the town, as well as Kamloops Naturalist Club. She's been here to help with some of our summer and, no, it was the March break camp, wasn't it?
Camps,
yeah, the March break camp. And getting the word out about what you can do about invasive species, what you can do working with native species. I'm so thrilled that you're here tonight. A real passion for science is what we're all about, and I can see it when I've been talking to you tonight too. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Megan, who's going to talk Rooted in Nature, Cultivating Beauty and Biodiversity with our native plants. Thank you so very much for coming tonight.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. Very excited that y'all could make it. It's great to see everyone. I hope you enjoy the talk. So first of all, before we begin, I would like to just take a moment to gratefully acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the traditional unceded territory of the Secwepemc, known as Kamloops. I'm very grateful to have grown up my whole life here in Kamloops and had the opportunity and continue to have the opportunity to explore and learn about these beautiful lands. So quickly about me, again, my name is Megan Blackmore. I am a Master Gardener, so I took the basic training for the Master Gardener Thompson Shuswap chapter. I'm also a certified horticulturalist. I took my training at TRU in around 2016, 2017. That's kind of how I got into plants and into the gardens. I'm an avid naturalist, so I've gone outside of the garden landscapes and into the natural scapes, and really just anything living is of interest to me. I find it all really cool. So I'm also an amateur macro photographer. So not professional by any means, but photography is really a way that I connect with the land. It's a way that I see all these living things and can capture their beauty and look closer at them. So today, we're gonna talk about why grow native plants. What is the purpose? Why might you wanna have them in your gardens? Choosing what to grow, so what kind of species you might want to grow in your garden, where to source, and how to care and maintain them. First of all, I'd like to define what a native species is. So when we say native species, in the horticultural world, you may hear them talked about as straight species or wild species. So this means the genetics that are found out in the natural landscape. They haven't been bred and cultivated into different species than what you would actually find out in nature. And native species have been here for millennia. They have lived and evolved on these lands, and they're co-evolved with all the other species in the area. They have a role to play in our ecosystems. And they're adapted to the local conditions. So they're the ones that are out there surviving the climate that we are experiencing all the time and without help. Now, in the horticulture industry, so when we're in a garden center, you might hear the term nativars. This essentially just means native cultivated variety. So they've taken those native species and they have cultivated them. They've selected for specific traits. They may be for vigor, for performance, so they have bigger flowers, they flower more often, they have more robust leaves, or they might be for aesthetics. So we thought that those flowers were prettier than other ones. They either have maybe a different color, more petals, whatever it might be. They've been selected for some reason. If you are wanting to grow native species to benefit the native insects and pollinators and wildlife in our area though, you may want to try to avoid things like double petals, color changes, or just other drastic changes to the plants. And that's because the species that evolved with them recognize them in their natural state. And if they have all these double petals, different colors, they might not necessarily recognize that that is that species anymore. And with double petals, it actually makes it very difficult for things like bees and other pollinators to get into the resources that they're trying to access. So you can see like these double petals up here. It's very pretty, very showy to us. But if you're a little bee or if you're a hummingbird and you're trying to get into that pollen and nectar, it's very difficult to get through all of those petals. And oftentimes when a plant has been bred to have these extra petals, they're trading off something for those extra petals. So they're trading off things like the anthers that make the pollen and making petals instead of that. So we're actually reducing the amount of resources that they create for these species. Sounds good. Sure, go ahead.
It was just about the photo. So the upper ones were double petals. The lower ones were those.
Yeah. Yeah, so the upper ones there are showing some of our natural species that have been bred for having those double petals. Gaillardia, the blanket flower on here, is typically yellow in its natural state. So Gaillardia aristata that we have on our landscape isn't usually that much red. And then the yarrow is usually white. And so this one has yellow. There's all sorts of different kinds of colored yarrow in the garden centers, but they're not usually that color in nature. Thank you. So when we look at things like our tags on plants in the garden center, the content that's on those tags is trying to entice you to buy them. They're marketing that plant and getting you to want to buy them, of course. This is a tag. It's a picture of one that I physically have at home because I took it from when I worked at a garden center. And it says native on it. This is a native plant is what it was marketed as. However, Hydrangea arborescens is actually native to the eastern North America. This brand has this native line of plants that it markets as native, but its idea of native is across North America. They are absolutely correct in saying that this is a native plant or native cultivar of a plant that is found in North America. Absolutely. And it's not a bad plant. It's great in the gardens anyways. But someone in BC seeing this tag and thinking, oh, it's native, and planting in their garden, it's not really planting a plant that's actually native and beneficial to our species in this local ecosystem. So be aware when you're looking at plant tags and other advertisement for plants in garden centers, and just do a little more research on them and look into it. Where is it native to? So when you say, oh, it's native, and we're sitting in Kamloops, we're probably thinking of this kind of area around us. But maybe the plant tags are thinking of native to BC. Maybe they're thinking native to the Pacific Northwest. Or maybe they're thinking North America. There's a lot of different ways that we can define native. So it's also up to you to define what you think is native. If you want to put it in your garden, you think, you know what, if it's from North America, that's pretty cool to me. It's not from Europe, it's not from Asia, it's a little bit closer. But you might want it to be specifically from the Kamloops area, or even just BC. Personally, kind of around the BC border is sort of, and the Pacific Northwest more so is what I consider native. Particularly, I often will think of something being native when I think there are species of bees and beetles and butterflies and all sorts of different wildlife here that have co-evolved with it in some way. So if there's something that it has evolved with it and will recognize and be able to utilize this plant as best as it can. BC is incredibly biodiverse. So we have a lot of different species. We don't have to go all across North America to find these cool species. And we can benefit a lot of different species by growing native plants in our garden. So this is just a snapshot of some of the numbers of different species that we have here. And it's an incredible amount of different species that we support. And in particular with bees, just the southern interior of BC has over 400 species of native bees. That is incredible diversity, and it's the most diverse area out of Canada for that. And I will note that not one of our native bees is the honeybee. They are from Europe, but we have an incredible variety of all sorts of other bees and pollinators that we can support. And specifically our grasslands that we live here in. Grasslands make up less than 1% of the land in BC, but that supports and provides habitat for greater than 30% of our species at risk, which is incredible. We're at the northern tip of the Great Basin ecosystem of the grasslands. We have a lot of diversity because the species here are at their range limits often. And they're encountering the edges of these ecosystems and new ecosystems. And they're at northern areas, so they're encountering different extremes than they normally would. And there's a lot of diversity because of that. So we have a lot of incredible species. I want to go through just a few really interesting examples of these species relationships. So the coevolution of these plants and insects together. Things like buzz pollination is really interesting. So we have some plants that are here that have evolved to require bumblebees and Andrena species of bees specifically because they know how to pollinate them properly. Other bees don't know how to do it. And what they do is they latch on to the flowers. You can see this kind of column that sticks out, and they buzz their wings. And they know to do that so that it shakes the pollen out. Honeybees and other bees don't know how to do that. They require these native bees that know how to do that. There's also things like hidden resources, so hidden nectar, things like the columbine. The nectar is up in these spurs way at the top there. It hides it way in these tubes. So only things like hummingbirds that have a long beak or butterflies with a long proboscis, only they can get up into that resource. Other little bees and insects, they can't reach that. They've co-evolved with these hummingbirds and butterflies because they dangle their pollen down at the bottom here. And so when a hummingbird is reaching its tongue way up in there and is trying to stretch up and get that resource, its face is getting pollen on it. And when it goes to the next plant, the pollen-soaked cheeks are touching those parts again and transferring that pollen that way. So they've co-evolved with the species that are here to have these special mechanisms. We also have things like host specificity. So different insects, like a lot of butterflies, need specific plants for their larvae to feed on. Often when we see the showy adult stage of butterflies, we'll see them on all sorts of different flowers, and it's the part that we think of when we think of a butterfly, but there's more to its life cycle. And so when they're larvae, they eat plants as caterpillars. And oftentimes they can't just eat any plant. Some are generalists and they can eat quite a few, but things like monarchs, which we've probably all heard of, they require milkweed specifically. And if they don't have milkweed, their larvae cannot live and we don't get the adult butterflies. And so planting milkweed can support that whole life cycle. The great spangled fritillary specifically needs violets. And then the sagebrush sheep moth, of course, as its name suggests, needs sagebrush. And the Compton tortoiseshell needs birch, willow, and poplar. And actually quite a few different butterfly species utilize these types of trees and shrubs, which is not the type of plant we think of when we think of butterflies as pollinators. So if we want to grow our gardens to support things like butterflies and these different pollinators, we need to think of their entire life cycle, not just the showy part that we see on our flowers. We need to think of all the resources that they need throughout their life. And all in all, we need healthy ecosystems to live. We need all of these different species that play a role in our ecosystem. We rely on healthy ecosystems for things like the water filtration and retention. So as water rains down, washes through our grasslands, washes through wetlands, it cleans the water. We need the carbon sequestration. So grasslands are actually really great at storing carbon. And especially with grasslands, unlike forests, which keep all their carbon up in a lot of mass of branches and bark and all their wood above ground. And then if a forest fire comes through, it releases all that back in the atmosphere. Grasslands store most of the carbon down in the ground in their roots, extensive long root systems. So when a fire goes through it, some carbon is released, but not a lot of it. Most of it is all still underground. And those roots also are really great for erosion control. So they hold that soil together. I guarantee this pathway, which is up at McConnell Lake around here, without those plants, that pathway would be in the lake already. And also nutrient cycling. So I've got a little picture down here of one of my favorite beetles in the area, which is actually a dung beetle, which, yeah, it was kind of interesting getting down on the ground that close to look at it, because we were in a big cow patty, but they're really important for our ecosystem because we need that part of it. We need to think of all these different species that play some sort of role in the entire health of the ecosystem around us. And overall, we live because everything else does. We need all of the native species that keep our lands healthy for us to be healthy. So supporting biodiversity is supporting us. But there are threats to biodiversity. We have lost a lot of different species and a lot of them are threatened. The top threats to biodiversity are things like habitat loss, invasive species, and climate change. And of course, there isn't always things that we can do. We can't just immediately fix this. Everyone in this room can have some role to play, but there's a lot of things that we can't always do to help stop all of this. But you can create habitat, which is the biggest threat to biodiversity. Your gardens can help provide the resources, space, and habitat for these species to help support their life. And there's other benefits with native plants. So native plants, especially in our area, are very drought tolerant. They are living out in our semi-desert, very dry landscape, and they don't have anyone out there with watering can with them. They're doing it all on their own, and they're able to survive that. They're also very hardy for our winters. Of course, again, they're out in those winters without any help, so they're very hardy. And they have a lot of reduced maintenance. So sometimes with our garden plants, they require us to constantly be deadheading and pruning and keeping their care up and adding fertilizer and helping them along. But our native plants, again, they don't really need that help. You can sometimes do a little more maintenance to make them a little prettier or a little bit more better performing. But for the most part, they are just fine on their own. So now that we know the importance of growing native plants, let's look at a few things that we want to grow. Before selecting your plants though, because usually I would just run to the garden center and compulsively buy all the plants, planning is a good step. So when you look at your yard and you're starting to plan to grow native plants, you want to do a few things. Start off by assessing the site conditions. So look at your yard. What kind of conditions are you working with? Looking at things like the sun exposure, because if you have a lot of shade versus if you have full hot Kamloops sun, you're going to be able to grow different things. Your water availability, so how much can you water? Do you have access to be able to supplement some water for things that might need a little bit more moisture, a little bit help in those really dry, hot times? Or does it need to really be able to survive well on its own because you don't have a lot of access to water for it? Also looking at your existing plants. So most of us here probably aren't going to just dig up our entire yard and start fresh and only plant native plants. You've probably already got a garden that you're working with, and you don't want to just completely clear that out. You want to look at the plants that you have and start kind of matching them with things that will complement and work well with them. So things that have similar water needs and things that also like sun, or you might have a large shrub with some space under it and you have a little bit of shade that can grow underneath that shrub. So looking at what you have to work with. And also looking at your soil type. So throughout Kamloops, there's different soil types. You've got a lot rockier soils, the higher up you are, silty soils when you're on those silt benches, and different pockets of more clay or sand depending on where you are. So knowing your soil type and what kind of plants naturally grow in those soil types can really help you out. And also the functionality of your yard. You want to be able to still use your garden and enjoy it. I don't want you to suddenly rip up your garden and put a bunch of native plants, but then not be able to use it and not really like the look of it. Because as much as that will help biodiversity, you still want to have something that you enjoy. You want to be able to utilize your yard. So look at the functionality of it and see how can you create a garden that supports biodiversity and you also still like to be in and you want to have it and you want to maintain it. And of course, your preferences. You don't need to grow plants just because it's great for biodiversity, but you don't like it and it's kind of ugly to you. Grow plants that you like. There's tons out there. There's lots of different options. So you don't have to just grow, the certain type of grass or this certain flower and you don't really like the look of it. There's lots of different things, and I'm sure there's something that you'll find beautiful. So looking a little bit at the Kamloops geography, as I said, with different soil types. Of course, this is a little more extensive than we'll go into just today. I do have a link here, and I will give my PowerPoints out at the end here that will be available to this PDF about Kamloops geography. Really interesting read if you're interested in that. Quite a lot of information in there, but something I found really interesting in it was showing how the geography of Kamloops changes throughout the areas. So like I said, those higher up areas are very rocky, and you're getting more of that volcanic rock. So I'm sure if anyone here is from Aberdeen and you tried to dig a new hole for like a tree, you've cursed a little bit while doing that because they often have very rocky soils in that area. And then when you get down to places like Juniper up in Sun Rivers and you're on those silt benches, of course, silt bench, you have very silty soils in those areas typically. Whereas then if you get lower down into the valley and you're right along the riverbed, depending on which river you're on, you may have more sand or rock or gravel in those areas. So kind of knowing your area and what you're dealing with can help. And also know that it's not your fault if there's tons of rocks in there, it's just where you live. So now some species recommendations. Some really beautiful ones that are very popular are things like the shrubby penstemon, which is an absolutely gorgeous plant, and I think one of my favorite native plants to suggest for gardens. It's very, very showy. It gets huge patches of these beautiful purple flowers. They're quite large tubes, so a whole bumblebee can fit inside of that, and it's really fun to watch them go into it. And just really overall great performer. Great for rocky sites. You often find them just right on the cliff edges, and so really great for that. They also have evergreen leaves, so they can have some winter interest. They're quite low growing, but it is something that's a little bit unusual for the Kamloops area. There isn't a lot of evergreens around here, aside from things like the usual junipers and the conifer trees. We also have things like the blanket flower, which is quite common to already have cultivars in our garden center. You might be familiar with it already. So it's a really nice, large, showy flower, beautiful performer. And also if you deadhead it, you can often get a rebloom, so you can extend that season a little bit. Yarrow, of course, is very common in gardens already. It's one, again, that has lots of different color morphs, all sorts of different ones available. The native one is yellow, but it's a really, really great pollinator plant. It's got a nice big white flower that's like a big landing pad for all sorts of things. It's like a big target. It says, come to me. And a lot of butterflies, bees, and all sorts of pollinators. A lot of beetles will like it as well. Just tons of pollen resources for them. But also got things like the heuchera, or the roundleaf alum root, which if you are familiar with botanical names, heuchera might be familiar because this is our coral bells, which are often grown for their leaves. Usually there are all sorts of different larger leaves of different colors like purples and reds, but our native heuchera just has little green leaves, but a really interesting flower spike, these white flowers that stick up, and really does quite well in gardens. Another really great one for rocky soils. The showy daisy, of course, as its name suggests, it's quite showy. Really beautiful, large flowers. Mature stands of it can get just absolutely covered in flowers and is really beautiful to see, and definitely a pollinator favorite. A lot of these aster families, so when they have that typical daisy look to them, are really great for pollinators. Our western columbine, as I said before, it's one that hummingbirds love and different butterflies, and it's just a really interesting flower. So that's a nice one. A little bit more of a shaded area. It doesn't quite like our full hot sun. You'll find it more in those forested areas as you start to get into the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forests. And also some grasses. Of course, we are in the grasslands, so we have some grasses here. Definitely a nice feature for gardens to have different textures. And grasses can also be very important for bees, as a lot of them will overwinter in the grasses. A lot of the queen bumblebees will like to kind of sleep in them in the stems over the winter. So it's a great addition for habitat for more of that life cycle. Things like the blue bunch wheatgrass that we have is a very common one for more of the lower grasslands. Giant wild rye is a beautiful one for more of a feature type grass with the nice blue leaves. And it's also indicative of a little bit more moisture. It can do very well in dry situations, but you'll find it in areas around town or around Kamloops that have just a little bit more moisture in them. So you can see where different seepages and in those different valley areas that it grows. And then the fescues is a little bit of the higher grassland areas. So some different textures and different things you can add to your garden. And then ground covers. And I really encourage the use of ground covers because it's kind of like a living mulch. They cover the ground and fill in those areas that weeds and water evaporation would usually occur. So covering that ground just kind of fills in that area and can really help with that moisture retention in the soil, can help to cool the whole area instead of having like rocks or anything in your garden. Pussy toes are really beautiful. There is the rosy pussy toes, which has a little bit of a kind of pink and red flower to it, which can be very dainty looking, and they cover the ground really well with a very, very low foliage. The kinnikinnick, of course, is a quite common one, already in a lot of gardens, and it's a really nice evergreen plant. It's very tolerant of a lot of different dry conditions, can be used in low traffic areas, so it can be walked down a little bit because it's a quite thick leaf. Bumblebees love the little pink flowers in the spring. It's also a nice one with long draping branches for if you have like a rock wall or some kind of feature that you want it to drape over. So that's a nice use for it. Also the bunchberry, which I have a fun fact for. It's usually found in a little bit more moist areas. But it is one that I, in every opportunity that I get, will tell everyone my fun fact, which is that it is actually the fastest moving plant that we know of. And I don't mean growth, I mean actual just movement of a plant. So I have a fun little GIF here that shows you the flowering, which is very slowed down. And so it's a little unimpressive just seeing this, but the thing is, it reaches a speed of 24 kilometers per hour in 0.2 milliseconds, which is really hard sometimes to just understand how fast that is. But the way that this happens is the anthers, the pollen bits inside of it, grow faster than the petals, and it builds up pressure, and it's got a little trigger hair. And when a bug comes over or something taps that trigger hair, it rips open the flower like this, and it flings the pollen at the whatever is on top of it, so the bumblebee or whatever insect. Extremely excessive for what it's trying to achieve here, but really cool nonetheless. So really fast movement and just kind of a fun thing. You know, if you have the family over for a barbecue, you can be like, I've got a fun fact to talk about over here. Or maybe that's just me with the crazy plant stuff. So then looking at some shrubs, getting a little bit of larger plants here. Red osier dogwood is also very common in gardens already, so it's one that we use in the horticulture industry a lot because it performs really well and just is overall a very good plant for landscapes. It does well in a lot of different conditions. And with these nice big panicles of white flowers, is really great for pollinators as well. And of course it has the winter interest with the red stems, so in the winter you still have some color, a little bit of interest in your garden. Ocean spray is a beautiful addition to gardens. We find it more towards the east into the Shuswap area, but it does still do quite well in gardens in the Kamloops area. It's still quite drought tolerant, and it's incredible for pollinators with huge sprays of white flowers. And then mock orange is really a lovely one. Definitely one that is already quite popular in gardens and has these amazing shows of beautiful white flowers that are very nicely fragrant and great for pollinators. Some other shrubs are things like Oregon grape, which is another one of our evergreens, and a broadleaf evergreen, which is really quite nice. So there's a nice texture in the winter that you can have. It also gets beautiful yellow flowers in the spring, which is great for pollinators, and then it gets a little kind of dusty blue berry on it throughout the rest of the year, which is edible. It's a little bit sour, but it is kind of a nice one for like jams or jellies that you want to make, or leaving them for wildlife. It's also one that you can use for hedging, so it is actually a pretty nice one that can get very dense for a privacy hedge. And of course, it's then fire smart. It's not as flammable as something like our cedars that we often grow as hedges. Saskatoon is a really lovely shrub as well. Beautiful white flowers in the spring, and then a very nice tasty berry as well. And then rabbit brush. And I cannot recommend rabbit brush enough. It is absolutely incredible for pollinators. So it's a later season bloomer, and it blooms really late into the fall. I've seen it actively blooming right into like the end of October around here. So it's one that's really great for our pollinators as it's getting later in the season and things are starting to go dormant and die down for the year. This is providing so much resources for all sorts of different insects and is really showy with these beautiful displays of yellow flowers. So we've looked at why native plants are important and why you might want to grow them and what sort of things you might want to grow. Your next question is probably, where do I get them? Where can I get native plants? And this can be a bit of a tough question because they're not always as readily available in garden centers as a lot of our ornamental species. So the biggest thing that I can recommend right now is ask garden centers. A lot of them do have suppliers that have native plants, but our garden centers don't really know to bring them in. I used to work in a garden center myself, and I actually did the ordering for a couple of years while I was there. And if I didn't really know the plant that well before I kind of knew native species and knew about them, I didn't know how to tell people about it. I didn't want to bring it in because it kind of just sit there and I didn't really know how to help them want to buy it. I didn't know people would want it at all, and I couldn't help them understand why they would want it. And so the more people that ask garden centers for these plants to bring in, they're going to realize there's a demand and people do want native plants. They're going to realize that these are popular and people want to support biodiversity, so they'll start to bring them in. And that will create the demand for the suppliers as well to grow more of them and grow more different types of native plants to be available. Some nurseries I would like to note, though, that are growing native plants and are really great sources are places like Split Rock Environmental, which is in Lillooet, which specializes in native plants. They also have just recently started up doing deliveries to Kamloops. So you can order online, they actually will deliver. It's delivery priced by weight. I actually haven't done it myself yet, and so I don't know kind of that price range, but there is that option because sometimes it's very hard to get it locally. So really great one there. Zen's Aerscape Endemic Nursery in Kelowna is beautiful. I was just there a couple weeks ago actually, and they have a lovely selection. They're mainly for restoration, but if you call or email them ahead of time, they can kind of gather stuff. They'll send you pictures about what they have to sort of arrange your order beforehand, and then just picking up in West Kelowna. Really amazing people there and great selection, so I highly recommend that. Sagebrush Nursery down in Oliver is also a great one. They do a lot of ornamental plants as well as some native plants. And they also are a good supplier for our garden center, so it's one that they will sometimes source from. And then Quality Seed Collections in Kamloops is a company that collects seeds locally. So they have really beautiful quality seeds. They clean them up really nice and have all the labels of where they were collected from. A really great source for that. And then there are the local genes, because sometimes when you will buy native seeds, it depends on where they're collected from. Their genes might be a little bit more adapted to wherever that location was. That might be slightly different than here. So having a local source is really great. You can also collect your own seeds. So you might want to go out into the landscapes and find those local species that are here and collect them for your own garden. If you do this, I do recommend that you collect just small amounts from multiple plants. Instead of taking all of your seed from just one plant, which has all the same genetics, take a little bit from each plant so you get a bit of a diversity, especially if you're wanting to continuously get seeds from the plants that you're growing in your garden. Because if you collect all from just one plant and they're all have the same genes, they will slowly get inbred if you continuously get the seeds just from that one plant. So get a bit of a diversity, and that's going to really help with the health of the plants that you grow and collect your seeds from later on. Cleaning the debris from seeds can really help. So a lot of the seeds, like the one in these pictures here, a lot of those asters have kind of a big fluffy plume that they ride the wind with. Cleaning that off can really help because that's just debris that isn't germinating with the seed. It might rot, and it can sometimes kind of affect the germination rates. So I do recommend that you kind of take off all those extra bits when you are going to grow any seeds that you've collected. Also, if you're collecting seeds, please make sure that you're not collecting on private land unless you have permission from the landowner, and also make sure you're not collecting in parkland especially, or any protected areas. Make sure that you are on public land. And don't deplete resources. So if you're in an area and there's just a couple of one plant, don't take all of its seeds, because our ecosystems need it too. Kind of a best practice rule for harvesting, we typically think of taking only about 10% of what you see. So leaving most of it for the environment, and really a lot of it's quite abundant, and these plants make a lot of seeds, so you don't need to take the whole population that's there. You can just take a little bit and make sure that it still has enough to replenish itself. And I do really recommend using labels. I have collected a lot of seeds and I'm growing a lot of things that I can't quite identify yet, and I did not label and I forgot what they were. I always go out and think, oh, it's so distinct, I know exactly what this is, I'll remember. I never do. So if you're gonna collect your own seeds, really recommend that you label them. I also want to note, if you are going to collect seeds, please be aware of invasive species. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of them in our area, and they can be very beautiful and very enticing to grow. But unfortunately, they are very harmful to our environment and they harm our biodiversity. So it's really important that we don't contribute to their spread. So please learn to identify invasive species and make sure that you're not collecting them, you're not growing them and continuing to put them on the landscape. And if you do come across invasive species when you are out there, please report them, because we can't manage them if we don't know where they are. So it really helps us out to help with this cause. Also, with native plants and the idea of growing for pollinators, a lot of people are turning towards wildflower seed mixes. Because like the marketing of the plant tags that says native with it, these unfortunately often contain invasive species and rarely contain native species. So unfortunately, a lot of these wildflower seed mixes are just wild flowers. They're not necessarily native flowers, which they are not claiming. They do not claim that they're necessarily native. And so their marketing is correct. It's just in our head, we often think of wild as being out in the wild, as being native species. But as with these examples that I have here, this wildflower garden for butterflies, on that package, that picture, that blue is bachelor buttons, or cornflower sometimes called, which is invasive. So that is showing right there that it has invasives in it, unfortunately. They do very well. They're very easy to just spread them out in your field and have them grow wild. So they are a wildflower, but unfortunately they often escape that and cause harm. Same with this package here that claims wildflower mix Canadian. It makes you think that this must be wildflowers out in the wild in Canada. Not one of the species in this mix was actually from Canada, and some are actually considered invasive in Canada. So please, if you're going to use wildflower mixes, do look into them. Read their content lists if they have one available. They don't always, so be wary of the ones that don't list what's in them. But read that content list and see what's actually in it before purchasing. Also, when you're starting your own seeds, some tips are to understand that with native plants and with a lot of plants, they have something called germination inhibitors. So a lot of seeds, they don't want the plant to grow, seed, drop on the ground, and immediately start growing, because that's often midsummer or times that are really harsh for them to just start growing, and those seedlings would not survive. So a lot of them, when they drop in the summer, when it's really hot out, they stay dormant. They have some kind of chemical or something in them that needs to be changed before they can germinate. Sometimes that is temperature, so going through a winter. They have to have that cold period before they'll start to grow. So if you're collecting seeds in the summer or in the fall and you try to germinate them in your house, or you try to just keep them in a cupboard and then pull them out in the spring, they probably won't germinate for you because they need that cold period. They don't think they've had winter yet, and it's not spring to them. So you might need to break that by having them go through that cold period. They also might have chemical inhibitors. So some of them, they actually might need some sort of chemical reaction to help them grow. Whether this just be water in some instances, but some seeds in our landscape are actually adapted to fire. So they might need smoke to initiate that germination. So those ones can be very difficult to germinate in a home garden setting. So recognizing things that have that, unfortunately, you might realize that might be hard to grow. There's also physical barriers. So some seeds might need to be scratched up before they can grow. There's a plant called lemonweed, which its other common name is stone seed. It's a very hard little stone that the seed looks like, and it actually often needs to be scratched. And some different seeds need that kind of scratching to be able to allow water and nutrients to get into it to initiate that germination. And so recognizing, again, those ones that might need it, you might need to just kind of rough it up a little bit. Because out in nature, it would just be a matter of time being roughed up in the ground and having that movement that would scratch it up. Also with the chemical, I should mention that a lot of our berries, so a lot of fleshy fruits, need to go through a digestive tract or have some kind of acid reaction because they're often eaten by birds or bears or other animals and then deposited by them afterwards, and they need that reaction to help them germinate. You don't have to eat them to get that. There are other ways to do it. You can use just a little bit of usually like vinegar or lemon juice, different concentrations, just to help kind of initiate that without doing it the natural way. Also, when starting seeds, you should always make sure that you have good drainage. So the seeds like moist soil, but not sopping wet, constantly just dripping wet soil. Our seeds here are not used to that. They are used to having just moist soil or flushes of wet that then dry out. They don't want to sit in that wet soil constantly. And really just a good thing for most seeds, honestly. Overwintering outside, so breaking that temperature inhibitor can really help. A lot of times when growing native plants, you can just seed a tray and then just leave it outside for the winter. And then bring it inside, and that will give you that temperature. You don't have to try to put them in a freezer or into a fridge to break that. Just leave them outside to do their natural thing. And I also want to note, be patient. Native seeds sometimes really take their time to germinate. They're not as quick as a lot of our ornamental plants that have been selected to be very vigorous, quick growers. So be patient with your native plants if you're trying to seed them. And also online, there are a number of guides for different species, especially popular ones that everyone likes to grow. So you can start searching up online how to germinate whatever plant you have. And there's often people who have tried it and have started to find methods for it that you might be able to find that information online for. When it comes to watering, a lot of native plants, if you buy them from a garden center, so they've been started in a pot, they've been watered in a pot their whole life so far, you can't just put them outside and then forget about them. It's often the idea with native plants that, well, they're on the landscape by themselves with nothing. They must be fine if I just plop them in the ground and forget that they exist. But when you're starting them, when you first plant them, they do need a little bit of help to get established. And then they can become more drought tolerant over time. So because our native plants, the way that they're drought tolerant is often from a really extensive root system. So they have really long reaching roots that can get deep down into the soil and find all the little bit of moisture that's there. If they're in a pot, they don't have that root system. They are very constricted. So when you put them in the ground, they don't have those reaching roots that can find all that moisture. So they just need some help, a little bit of water to get that root system established, and then you can start to wean them off of that. And then they'll be more drought tolerant. So do help them along in those first year or two. When you're watering, make sure that you're watering deeply and infrequently. So don't give them just a little bit of water every single day, because that's gonna make the roots wanna grow up in the little first couple inches of the soil, because that's where the water is. But if you're watering deeply, they're going to chase that water down, and infrequently will teach them that up in that top layer of soil, it dries out and you don't want a lot of roots there. So it helps to train them to get that really big root system that's drought tolerant. And avoiding excess water. So as we talked about, when you're assessing your site, you might have access to more water. You might be able to give them a lot of water. And in some cases, with like our ornamentals, they perform better with the more water you can give them. A lot of our native plants, it's actually not very beneficial to them to have way more water than they'd be used to. They can have a little bit more and they will be fuller, but if you give them tons and tons of water and it's like they're living down on the coast, a lot of them, if they will grow very quickly, but it's faster than they're used to, and they might flop because it's not very hardy growth that's growing from that, because they're growing like crazy. They have tons of water, lots of resources, and just unfortunately they often flop. And it's also just unnecessary. We don't need to be watering like crazy when we're using native plants, and we should be conserving our water. Mulching can be really beneficial and really help out with water retention and also keeping weeds down in your garden. So reducing that competition of things like invasive species and other weeds that are trying to compete with your plants. Highly recommend using organic mulches, because things like rocks and plastic are very hot and they don't add organic matter for nutrients for your plants. So rocks, of course, heat up a lot. And some plants, like we talked about, are more adapted to those rocky areas. But a lot of times that's just a lot of heat that's unnecessary for it, and it doesn't break down and give nutrients back to the soil. Your soil microbes as well want something to eat, and so that they can be healthy and help your plant. And plastics, of course, putting a layer of plastic on the ground it can often heat up and just cook your soil microbes, which then is not healthy for the rest of your garden. It's also hard for water to penetrate as well, and any insects that want to get into the ground around those gardens, it inhibits them. So try to avoid that when possible. And of course, being in the area that we are, fire smart is often on the top of people's minds. So looking at different fire smart materials, because some mulches, things like wood chips, pine needles, can be quite flammable. So it might not be the best choice, depending on where you're putting it. But fire smart does note that mature compost or composted bark, so organic mulches that have started that breakdown process, they've started to decompose, they have a little bit more moisture to them and they're not as flammable. Also, again, trying ground cover plants instead. So growing plants in those areas fills in that area and keeps the temperature of your garden lower because those leaves are giving off water, they're transpiring. So that just overall reduces the temperature of your garden space. And overall just are benefiting more of the space in your garden. And I do want to note, it can be important to leave some areas bare for bees. So actually having just completely bare soil is beneficial for a lot of our native bees that nest in the ground. So they have open soil that they like to dig down in and create their nest in. A lot of them are solitary. They'll make a little tunnel and they put their eggs down in that area. So native bees sometimes can benefit from completely abandoned areas of your yard. And I will note with this picture here, this is my front garden, which looks like an absolute mess in the spring. But what I do is in the fall, when everything's starting to die back, I cut everything off and then just lay it back right down on top of the garden. And this helps to insulate those plants over winter, so it gives them a bit of a protection barrier, especially with the weird winters we've been having. It can help to have a little bit more of a layer that insulates these plants over the winter. In the spring, when I'm starting to clean it up, I rough it up and get all that nice organic material from what my plants created last year, and I put it right back into the soil. And I quite rarely put any kind of organic matter, any kind of new soil into my garden because I'm just using what the garden made for itself. When it comes to maintenance, looking at things like shrubs, our native shrubs, they really don't need a lot of pruning. You don't need to do a lot of maintenance. If you prune them, they can start to grow in weird ways. They start to bud out from those cut areas and they can have kind of weird growth and you have to continuously then keep pruning them, otherwise they get quite odd looking. So less pruning can be better for them. Just let them do their natural thing. And if you want to prune, just doing light pruning, so not doing a whole lot to them. But looking at things like the DD&D rule, which we talk about in horticulture, which is dead, diseased, and dying. If it is a problem branch, or if it is dead, diseased, or dying, you can take that out of that bush, and that's going to help the health of it overall. Shape corrections, of course, if you're trying to leave it natural, but it's got one really weird branch off to the side, of course you can take that out and give it a little pruning. You can still keep a natural shape while making sure that's not quite as crazy as it maybe is trying to be. When it comes to perennials, of course you can cut them back. You don't have to as well. You will have the dead stalks there, so you might want to cut them back, you might not. You could leave some of the seed heads for winter interest. They look interesting, and also for birds to eat over the winter. You can also just leave them for structure in your garden, but you also might want to cut them back, and cutting them back with a little bit of a stub left, so not right down to the ground, if it has hollow stems, can be habitat for bees, and they will like to go into those hollow stems, so that can be beneficial to them. Wildlife benefit over winter, again, if you leave those seed heads for them to be able to eat, if you leave that material in your garden. And then, like I said I incorporate that debris back into the soil. You don't have to take away all that organic matter. It's free organic matter for your soil. Deadheading can also prolong flowering. So like I had mentioned with the blanket flower, the alum root, so the heuchera, also benefits from the deadheading, and columbine. People who have grown them in their gardens note that if you do deadhead them, you can get more flowers of them, so they'll rebloom. So you can prolong that blooming period. Now when it comes to pest control, because as gardeners, you're probably familiar with a lot of different pests and a lot of different things trying to eat your garden. Overall, if you're trying to grow native plants, you're trying to benefit biodiversity and pollinators, please avoid the use of pesticides. This really does not benefit them. It can really harm them, especially if used improperly. In certain instances, pesticides can be a great tool on landscapes, but in our home gardens, it is almost always unnecessary for us to be using harsh chemicals like that. You can attract beneficial insects. So having diverse plants and having plants that will attract those beneficial insects like ladybugs and lacewings, they will eat those pests for you. So different parts of their life cycles, like the ladybug as an adult will eat some aphids, but actually its larva is the main predator of them. They eat like crazy, all these aphids. And then also making sure that you can establish a balance. So nature has a balance. Pests have a part of the ecosystem. They play a role. And the beneficial insects will then eat them and keep them in check, and their populations balance each other out. So if you don't want pest problems in your garden, don't try to rid it completely of pests, because then you don't have any beneficial insects. And when those pests come, nothing's there to eat them. So you want to have a balance of both of them. Of course, with aphids, like we look at the top of those pictures, if you have a few aphids, that's great. They're food for the ladybugs and other beneficials, but they're not a problem. As we start to go along those pictures, of course, if you have a ton of aphids and the ladybugs or any other beneficials are not keeping up, you'll probably want to knock that back. Even just with a blast of a hose can knock them off, or squishing them with your fingers. Just knock back that population so that they can get a hold of it and the beneficials can start to create that balance. And one thing that I want to note is be excited that you're part of the ecosystem. I probably sound a little crazy, but if I see things like these leaves, I see this feeding pattern in leaves in my garden, I honestly get pretty excited. Not when a deer comes and mows down the entire plant in my garden. That's a little bit harder to appreciate. But if I see something benefiting and eating my plants a little bit, not to the point of killing them, but in some way benefiting, I'm pretty excited to be creating habitat and food for something else. Because I don't grow my garden just for me. I grow my garden for anything that wants to come and live in it, honestly. So some key takeaways of what we've learned today. Incorporating native plants is beneficial and very important. We've learned so many different native plants have roles to play, and they are needed in our ecosystems for healthy ecosystems for us to be healthy. And it's not all or nothing. You can start simple and learn as you go. You don't need to wipe out your whole yard and plant completely invasives or completely natives and get it all right the first time. You can just start by planting one native plant and just slowly incorporating them in. See which ones do better, and then go from there and learn as you go. Embrace being a part of the ecosystem. So if you're growing native plants, you're going to be getting native species that benefit from those plants. Or at least hopefully you will, because it's part of the ecosystem. You're creating habitat for them. And remember that you are making a difference, even if you just plant one native plant. And everyone here today just showing up and showing an interest in this and wanting to benefit biodiversity and grow for native species and grow native plants in your garden, you're making a difference. So thank you. Yeah, if anyone has any questions. Just the ones that I noted, specifically specialize in growing native plants, so that's something that they really focus on. A couple of them, like the Split Rock Nursery and Zen's Airscape, only grow native plants. They don't really grow other ones, and so that's kind of their main focus. So really, if you're trying to find native plants, they're a really great source for a lot of different kinds. Yeah, so that's Horiolisum, which is an invasive, unfortunately. Very pretty flower to it, but it's one, what's actually interesting about it is it's toxic to livestock. So it's one that's a really big problem in agriculture. When it gets into hay supplies, it can unfortunately poison livestock through there. Yeah. So it's going to depend on your soil type, how easily you can get water through that, how long you're going to have to stand there to water it. If you have really porous soil, so soils that are like sandy, the water is going to go really deep really quickly. It's going to absorb in. If you have higher organic matter, so if you're adding a lot of compost or leaf matter to it, it helps to absorb it quick. But if you have a lot of like really heavy clay or very silty soil with small particles, it doesn't absorb very quickly, so it might take more water to get it through to a deeper depth. But just making sure you're not just wetting that top surface. Yeah. Could you define deep? Deep. I don't have an exact like kind of number or like measurement for that. It's going to be a matter of kind of getting to know your soils. So after watering the first few times, you want to kind of like dig down a little bit and see if it's saturating right through or if it's just in that top layer. I don't have an exact measurement for exactly how far. Just making sure it's out of those first 4 to 5 inches or so. Like once it's kind of down past that point, just really getting lower into the ground where it's cooler. Yeah. Definitely different treatment options depending on the size of it will differ. You can, if you have the ability to like kind of like dig it out, kind of scrape that area and remove the material, you're probably going to have a lot of seeds that will continuously come up, but kind of depleting that seed bank as it keeps regerminating, depleting it, growing then other plants to outcompete it a bit. So growing like native grasses, any kind of native plants to start to establish them in those areas and keeping them healthy, so kind of supporting their growth so that they can start to reestablish and fill in that space. And just reducing disturbance once you have gotten it out of that area. Any kind of open soil is an invitation for invasives, so yeah. It should be in the garbage, yeah. Unfortunately, composting doesn't always break down all of the seeds or the plant parts and can continue to spread. So definitely putting it in the garbage, unfortunately, is the best way to get rid of it, yeah. No, they will be there continuously. With biocontrol, typically they're released and they establish their own population, and it's kind of like a passive management where we have them on the landscape. If they are kind of dwindling in numbers, they can be re-released, but typically they just begin their own cycle and they will reproduce and continuously be on that landscape. With biocontrols, the goal is to not eradicate the invasive plant, but just establish that balance essentially forever, to always kind of have this push and pull of the biocontrol and just making sure the invasive doesn't get out of hand. Definitely with Dalmatian toadflax, we're seeing a lot of success in the area with that. There's a few different biocontrols for it. Definitely the one you probably see is the little black weevil on it that eats the stem. Yeah, and so I'm not exactly sure when they emerge. I know it's kind of when they have flowers, when they're pretty like into the flowering stage, a little bit before when they're starting to bud. So they should be soon as they are starting to get to that stage, but I'm not sure the exact timing. Those would actually be different weevils that would be affecting that. So there's a lot of different weevils. Beetles in general is an extremely diverse group. And so there's a lot of different weevils, and they specialize on plants. They're not typically super generalists. So like the stem mining weevil for the Dalmatian toadflax specifically only eats Dalmatian toadflax. And so especially with biocontrols, it's really important that we study them so that they do that and they don't get out of hand. Definitely early trials of certain biocontrols have failed catastrophically in certain areas. Like if you've ever heard of like Australia with their invasives and certain biocontrols they brought in with like the cane toads and different beetles and things like that unfortunately got out of hand. So now there's very strict processes for biocontrols of making sure they are very specific to what they eat. So it would be other species that would be eating other plants. Well, thank you everyone. I'm very happy to have been here, and thank you for listening. I hope you learned something from this and are excited to grow some native plants. I will be providing my PowerPoint as a PDF for anyone who is interested, and I'll have my email in there. So if you do have any questions, if you just have plant pictures that you want to ask to identify, I love doing that, so please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions.
That's brilliant. Let's give her a big round of applause. Megan, on behalf of the Science Center, our guests, and everybody who will see this in the future because it's being filmed by Rogers, thank you very much, Lydia, for coming out again and doing this. I would like to present a small token of our thanks.
Thank you. It's awesome.
Honestly, I've found this inspiring. And you're absolutely inspiring yourself. Your enthusiasm, your ability to find the good in even like you say, very beautiful invasives. I think perhaps in this group, everybody's had a chance to get out in our local area, whether it's Peterson Creek, Lac du Bois, and or even just from the highway, and appreciate now the balsam root, the spring. We really live in such a gorgeous, gorgeous area. We're so very lucky to be in the Squamish lands. What I think, though, is if we could all bring just a teeny bit more into our own gardens and provide that biodiversity and that pure pleasure as well. I think we could also be inspiring with our neighbors and friends. So good luck with that. And if you need any information from this, we will have things available. We can send out, as you said, Megan, the PowerPoint PDF will be out. And we'll perhaps,
Beautiful.
yeah.
It really adds to your presentation to have such, really distinguishable plants.
Thank you.
Yeah, and honestly, we've got a few native plants in our garden. It makes me want to just go out and do more.
Yeah.
And so if we all could do a little bit, as you said, thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.